I'm going to go ahead and get started. So we'll pray. I've got a couple of resources for you to consider, and then we will dive into Revelation. So let's begin with prayer. Father, we thank you for again an opportunity to study your word. We thank you for the way that you have revealed yourself to your servant John and the mysteries that he is proclaiming to us. And we ask, Lord, you give us ears to hear what your Spirit is saying, not only to the churches of the first century, but to our church today. Stir in our hearts a sense of hope and anticipation for your return. And Lord, even though we may not fully understand all that is presented to us through John's vision, God, we trust that your Spirit will give us understanding. But we also trust that we know what the end is going to bring. And so we ask that you would just encourage us and give us hope. Let me ask this all in Jesus' name. Amen. A couple of quick resources I wanted to share with you. The first is this. It's a commentary by James Hamilton, who is a professor at Southern Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky. Some of you are familiar with Al Mohler. If you heard of Albert Mohler, it's the seminary that he's the president of. Hamilton's a good theologian, good thinker, and what I like about this commentary is that it's a set of sermons that he actually preached at his church that he prettied up to put in a book format. So they're very practical. It gives a lot of good scholarly information, but it's also very practical, a helpful read. So I would encourage this, and I agree with most of his conclusions. There's a few that I would take in a different direction, but for the most part, a really good, reliable guide. So I would encourage you to pick this up. The other book is older. It's dated, but it's still I find it still very helpful. By Millard Erickson. He was a well-known theologian, maybe a generation ago. He was a president, I think, at Bethel Seminary for a while. But he wrote a lot of good. He wrote a systematic theology and some other well-known texts. But he wrote a book on the different options for eschatology, looking at the pre-mill, mill, post-mill positions, their historical roots. And what I love about this book is that he's so even-handed in both talking about the strengths and weaknesses of the positions that by the end, when you get to the conclusion and he shares his view, it's almost a surprise, because he does such a good job being so even with all the other positions. A friend of mine got me this book back in college, and in working through it again, I found that his position is where I am, but you wouldn't know it reading the book. In fact, I was surprised by the end. I thought he was going to be a very strong dispensationalist by the time I got to the end of the book, but he wasn't. But that just shows how even he is in his and fairly presenting all the different views. So I would encourage, if you want to get a book that's just, hey, I want to look at all the different options, I don't want the author's agenda, I just want to look at every position, this would be a great resource to use. He does an excellent job of fairly representing all the different viewpoints, strengths, weaknesses, and then I think his conclusion is really good too. So you can come up and screenshot these afterwards if you'd like. And would encourage you to continue working through these issues that we're discussing. So we're going to go back to Revelation today and see how far we get. I've got notes up until the beginning of chapter 19. That's my hope, is to get that far, and then we'll do the Millennial Kingdom next week. So next week will actually be our last class. Sniff, sniff. Because I've really enjoyed doing this, and there's so much we didn't get to. I feel like, we should have talked about this, we could have talked about this, but time is not on my side. So we'll finish with the Millennial Kingdom next week, and so my goal will be to present the different options and then give you where I land. So with Revelation today, last week we did our introduction to Revelation. So if you weren't here for that class, you can get the extended notes from me. Just let me know. I'll be happy to send them to you. So I'm not going to cover a lot of ground that we did last week. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to review a couple of key points, and then we're just going to move right into the text. And I'm going to move through this. There's a lot of material here, so I will be moving through it quickly. So if at some point you're you're feeling kind of lost, just encourage you to get the extended notes that go into a lot more detail. And also the extended notes are designed that you can actually do the study on your own. So with all the extended notes we've done throughout the entire course, not just today, but through the entire course, you could easily just take your Bible and look at the notes and then just match it with the text we're looking at in the Bible and do your own study and be like, Pastor Grant is out to lunch on this one. He's got a good point here. And so I encourage you to be a good Berean and search the scriptures and see if what I'm saying is accurate or true or lines up with where you're at. So again, use the study notes, search the scriptures. Don't take my word for it. I want you to really keep being a good Berean and test everything according to God's word. So with Revelation, I will give you my best shot. This is admittedly a complex text. It's confused interpreters for generations. So when I hear prophecy teachers and others be like, it's so simple. It's not complex at all. It's this and 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 this. And I'm always like, well, maybe. But one of the greatest thinkers in church history, who's one of my heroes, John Calvin, who's the father of our Protestant faith, wrote a commentary on every book of the Bible except Revelation. The reason he didn't do Revelation wasn't because he didn't have opinions on it, but he felt that he didn't want to mislead anyone with his own attempt to try to exposit it. So he decided to not do a commentary on that because he was so, that shows his humility, also shows the fact he didn't want to mislead people, and he didn't want his word to be the people to take his word as the final word, and so he chose not to do one on Revelation. So if Calvin, approaches Revelation with fear and trembling, so should we. So when I hear these prophecy teachers just so confidently just saying like, this and this and this, I just think Calvin, with fear and trembling, approach Revelation. Who are you, right? You're here today, gone tomorrow. But and your prophecies always end up being wrong. So sorry, I don't mean to be negative already, but it just, it frustrates me. So anyway, that being said, this is my best attempt. So I'm going to be bolder than Calvin and try to tell you what Revelation means, but I do want to qualify everything I say with this is. This is a tough bear to try to hunt. But that being said, we are going to give it a shot. And so I want to encourage you again to continue to do your own study, and we'll give this a try. So last week I talked about some interpretive rules with Revelation. Some interpretive rules. So number one, we want to read Revelation in light of what the intended audience would have heard or understood. Okay, so the rule of thumb is this: it has to make sense to them before it makes sense to us. Okay, so this is a first century document written to first century churches, written by a first century individual, the Apostle John. Now it's the inspired word of God, so we know that it's written for us and for our benefit, but it's not written directly to us. It's written to a group of churches in Asia Minor in the first century. So they're the primary audience, so any interpretation that we take has to also make sense to them. So that gives us some guardrails in the way that we approach the text that many modern interpreters don't do. They're jumping right to Middle East politics. They're jumping right to nation states in our existence today, and so they bypass John's audience. So we don't want to do that. We want to make sure that we have John's audience in mind and keep asking, how would they have understood it? So we don't want to treat Revelation any different than we treat any other book of the Bible, because every other book of the Bible we do this, right? We say, who's the author? Who's the audience? What's the context? What's the message that the author is trying to communicate? We want to do the same thing with John. Second is we want to remain astute of John's Old Testament symbolism and his allusions. So John is a Jewish thinker. He's drawing from the Old Testament, and so a lot of what we see in Revelation is drawn out of John's Jewish thought world. So we want to pay attention to the way that John writes and thinks as as a Jewish thinker. Same thing when you read John's gospel. If John of Revelation and John of the Gospel of John are the same author, and scholars do dispute that, but the traditional viewpoint, the historic viewpoint, is that it's the same author, and that's my viewpoint. That's what I hold to as well. Just like John uses a Jewish thought world in describing Jesus to us, he's doing the same thing with Revelation. So we want to pay attention to the symbolism that John is using out of his Old Testament thought world. And then finally, interpretive humility. Interpretive humility, which in my opinion we don't see enough of today when people approach Revelation. We want to have interpretive humility and acknowledge that a lot of Revelation will be interpreted at the conviction level. There are absolutes in Revelation that everybody agrees on, but a lot of interpretation is conviction-based, meaning it could go a few different ways. Depending on how you approach it. So we want to use interpretive humility and come with an open hand on this and not be overly dogmatic or divide over Revelation. I think Christians that divide over Revelation I just don't think it's worth dividing over, as long as you agree on the absolutes, right? So that being said, John's numbering system is going to be very important for us to pay attention to as he is presenting, graphic images using numbers. So 7 represents wholeness, completeness, fulfillment. That's out of the Old Testament. The Old Testament has 7 as a holistic number. 4 often represents the world, the 4 corners of the earth. So when we're talking about earth or earthly matters, 4 often is the number that's used. 3 is used as a designation for God and for Jesus, the one who was, is, and is to come. So 3 often is a number reflecting God. But 3 can also be a reflection for a parody of God. And we're going to see that with Satan and the 2 beasts. You have Satan, the beast, and the false prophet. There's a 3. So it's a false trinity versus the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. So 3 is used in terms of describing God, but also parodies of God. 12 represents the people of God. 12 is representative of God's people. So you have 12 tribes of Israel in the Old Testament, and 12 is often used to represent who God's people are. And so we see 12 appear at strategic points throughout the book as well. Now, last week I said that everything you need to learn in life, you learn in kindergarten. You guys have heard that saying before. I would say everything we need to know about Revelation, we learn in chapter 1. And I might even extend that to say we learn in chapters 1 through 3. So chapter 1, you have the introduction. Chapters 2 and 3, you have John talking to, you have Jesus' word to these churches. Now, we just did a sermon series on Revelation chapters 1 through 3 earlier this summer. So if you were not here for those messages, would encourage you to go to the EBCU YouTube page and go back and listen to the messages. But especially the very first message where Pastor Stan introduced the context, the historic context. He introduced the churches. He introduced Jesus speaking to those churches. So I would go back and at least, the whole series is great, but at least listen to the first one and the way that Pastor Stan sets up Revelation, because I think he does a good job of that and trying to stay within the historic context of the letter. So I think chapters 1 through 3 get too quickly just kind of dismissed by modern interpreters, and we're not going to do that. We're going to try to root our reading of Revelation in chapters 1 through 3, chapter 1 in particular. So in chapter 1, here's what we find. John receives direct revelation from Christ about the church's current trials and troubles and the future situation that's going to call for perseverance and faithfulness. Okay? So he's writing to these churches about their present situation, and then he's going to talk to them about the future of what is to come and encourage them to hang on, to persevere, because of the reward that is coming to them, because of Christ's return that is promised to them. So it's talking to churches experiencing trials, struggles, and to persevere. That's the point of the book. So the church is described as ransomed by the blood of Jesus, kingdom of priests, royal priesthood, living under the present and future dominion of Christ. Okay, so Christ's dominion is present, but it's also the fullness of that dominion is coming. And he's writing to a specific group in Asia Minor, the first century, that represent the universal church throughout the ages. Okay, so these are historic churches, and they're real churches with real people in a real situation. Jesus has a word for each of those churches, but those churches also, we believe, represent situations that churches throughout history going to experience. So we read Revelation and learn from the experience of these churches for our own situations. So I don't believe these churches represent the church throughout church history. Some interpreters take it that way. Some interpreters take the churches as just symbolic and whatnot. I don't think that's the case. I think it's just like we want to learn from the church in Philippi, the churches in Galatia, the churches in Ephesus. Okay, when you read Galatians, Philippians, or Ephesus, historic churches, real people, but we listen to what the Spirit is saying to us through these churches. Same thing with Revelation. Same thing with Revelation. So we want to learn from these churches because, again, Jesus' word to them is his word also to us. The church is described, the present time is described as a time of tribulation. That's very important. It's described as a present time of God's kingdom being present. And the present time requires patience and endurance. Okay? So this is all chapter 1. Jesus is described as the faithful witness, firstborn from the dead, the one true king. Jesus is described as a series of sevens, indicating his perfection. Again, that number 7, meaning perfect and wholeness. Jesus is described in the same terms that both Daniel and Zechariah describe him, as well as Isaiah, one like the Son of Man who is pierced for our transgressions, the one who is pierced. So that's language that comes from Daniel, Zechariah, and Isaiah. Jesus is described as the crucified, risen one who has absolute authority over heaven and earth and will one day come in glory. All right? So Jesus is not absent, he's present, and his future glory is coming. So now we get to chapters 4 through 11. Okay, so chapters 1 through 3 are pretty straightforward. Most interpreters agree on those passages. Not a lot of debatable stuff. Chapter 4 is where the fireworks start. So many of you have probably heard it said that the church disappears in chapter 4. So you've got Jesus speaking to these churches in chapters 1 through 3, and then in chapter 4, the church is raptured and is gone, and the audience now becomes the tribulation saints. So you've got basically Jews, and then whatever future believers are going to be there in the time of tribulation. So I'm going to argue that the church does not disappear at all. The church is still present. And just because the word church isn't there, the word ecclesia isn't there, doesn't mean the church is gone. Because you're going to find that there's an audience in chapters 4 through 20 that reflects the same audience that we just described in chapter 1, as well as chapters 2 and 3. So we're going to pay careful attention to John's language and how he describes these people that are going through tribulation, and I want to show you that it's in my mind anyway, it seems like it's the same people that he's talking about in chapter 1, okay? So if you want to open up your Bible, so chapter 4 of Revelation, we're going to make our way through. Now, a couple of weeks ago, I talked about the rapture, and we looked at chapter 4 and the opening couple of verses of chapter 4 where people say that a rapture happens. If you weren't here for that, you can go back and you can look at the notes on that. I'm not going to cover that ground again, but I basically made the argument that I didn't find that persuasive, that it's a little bit of a stretch to read rapture into these first couple of verses. I'm not sure that's what John is talking about. I think what we see with John is that he receives a temple vision, similar to what Ezekiel experiences, Isaiah and Daniel, where he is getting a picture into God's future. And Jesus is revealing something to him. So when he says, come up here, John is leaving the earthly plane, so to speak, and he's moving into the heavenly temple, and he's getting a viewpoint, a new vantage point where he's seeing the bigger picture. Receiving a heavenly vision. I think that's the simplest way to interpret what's going on here. To read rapture into this, I think, is a little bit of a stretch, especially when you compare it to, again, Ezekiel 1, Isaiah 6, and Daniel 7 in terms of like these heavenly visions that these other prophets also received. So let's look at John's numbers. So John enters into a heavenly court, I believe, of God's elect people, right? The church. So, excuse me, you've got 24 elders, and which I think represents the 12 tribes of Israel, the 12 apostles, or you could even say Israel, Gentile together. There's different ways to look at that, but that number 24, 12 times 2, is a number of perfection. It's a number of wholeness. So I think that, again, that you have the 24 elders. I think it's representing all of God's people throughout history. You have the ransomed from every tribe, tongue, and nation present. And I think this is, again, the redeemed people of God who are destined to reign with Christ, to be that heavenly priesthood. It's similar language that John uses to describe the church in chapter 1. It's also language that's found throughout the New Testament to describe the church. And I've got those texts for you up there to do some comparison. So I think there's strong evidence that the audience in chapter 4 represents the people of God, the ransomed people of God. Chapters 4 and 4 and 5 there. So that's, again, I encourage you to do your own reading and your own comparison and just look at the language John is using, compare with other passages in the New Testament, and it looks pretty churchy to me, but I could be wrong on that. Okay, so let's go to chapter 6. Now, chapter 6 is the beginning of this series of sevens that are going to be opened up, that are going to reveal God's judgment on the earth. So we have start with the seven seals. Now, the interesting thing about the seals that appear is the way in which they parallel what Jesus describes in Matthew chapter 24. Now, we did Matthew 24 a month ago or so. I think it's one of the early lessons we did. And I shared with you that I think Matthew 24 is talking about the tribulation of the present age, as well as talking about the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem specifically, and then Christ's future return. And I encourage you to go back to Pastor Stan's message that he did last year on Matthew chapter 24. Most of my notes reflect what he taught. So if you want to get a good message on Matthew 24 and all the details, I just encourage you to go to our YouTube page and find Pastor Stan's message and just go ahead and listen to that and do your own study on that. So if we take Matthew 24 as true words from Jesus about that which is to come, and you look at, compare it with the different horses that appear, you find that, now the white horse I could go one of two ways on. All right, so I'll get to the white horse in just a minute. The red horse, wars of conquest. The black horse, economic unrest. The pale horse, famine and plagues. Then we have the martyrs, persecution of the church. And then we have the large earthquake, which initiates Christ's return. Now, the white horse, commentators go two ways on this, and I don't know. There's good arguments on both sides. So on this one, I've got the open hand. The white horse, elsewhere in Revelation, the white is always representative of God's people or of Jesus himself, and we have Jesus coming on the conquering white horse. So it's possible that the white horse represents the conquering of the gospel, the first horse to go out to say, just like Jesus said, that the gospel will be proclaimed to all the nations. In fact, I'm going to preach today on Matthew chapter 24, verse 14. That's what my main sermon text for this morning is going to be. So it's possible that that's what the white horse represents. The white horse is the first one out of the gate to show that the gospel, in the midst of all the other unrest that's coming, the white horse is coming out to also spread the gospel, which also lines up with what we see throughout Revelation with God's people continuing to worship him, to praise him, and the conquest of God's kingdom. So it's like no matter what tribulation and trials come, no matter what Satan throws at the church, the gospel will succeed. Now, the other side of the white horse is that it is actually, it's not representative of Jesus, but it's the parody. It's a parody of Jesus, and it's actually a horse that's going to bring death. And there's good evidence about the white horse representing is it the Paramethians? I think it's the Paramethians, but a first century group that was constantly kind of on Rome's backside. The barbarians eventually invaded Rome centuries later. They're always knocking on Rome's door, and so it's representative of death and of judgment. So it could be that that's what the white horse represents. So again, I can go either way on this. I kind of like, based on the rest of Revelation, with the white horse also representing Christ and the gospel and its parallels with Matthew 24, I like the gospel conquest side, but I could be wrong on that. It might be the sign of judgment. So I can go either way on that one. But basically, this is what's being now unleashed on the earth, and it represents, I believe, the tribulations of the church age, based on what Jesus said is going to be happening throughout human history. And so throughout human history, this is what we find. This is what human history is all about. Now, in the midst of this happening, of God's judgment happening on the earth, in the midst of that, you have a community that is being protected, from these judgments. So in chapter 7, you have what scholars call an interlude. So Revelation, there's judgment, and then there's these pauses, these interludes, in which John then he shifts his focus from those under judgment to those who are being protected from judgment, to what's happening with the community of God. So there's two things going on here. So he's saying it's going to be really bad for these people, but for these people, they will be protected and sealed and will be anticipating the conquest of Christ. So chapter 7, then, you have the 144,000, and then you have this multitude that nobody can count. Now, some commentators, some interpreters, this is common for a lot of prophecy teachers, they say that the 144,000 are the Jewish evangelists. It's a literal 144,000. And then the multitude that emerges out of that are those that are coming out of the trial in the tribulation. I struggle with that because to get that reading, you have to also have the church disappearing in chapter 4 with a rapture, you have to make a number of moves to get to that reading that I'm not sure John himself is making. It seems odd to me that if John is writing to these churches in Asia Minor to encourage them to persevere and telling them about the things that are to come, that the audience just switches out, and now he's talking about people in an experience that John's churches are never going to have. They're never going to go through. It just seems odd to me that the whole setup of the church disappearing and it's a whole different group that's now being talked about in chapters 4 through 19. That's nothing to do with John's original audience. When the reason John is writing to them is to encourage them to persevere for that which is to come. So I take the 144,000, again, looking at the way that John is using numbers as the whole people of God. The whole people of God. Now, it's possible that it might just be elect Israel and Jews throughout history. And that could be another interpretation you could take that I'm not as convinced about, but I could see the merit in that reading as well. But I prefer taking this as the whole of God's people, and here's why. So you've got, again, 12, the number of wholeness of God's people, but you have 12 squared. Not only do you have 12 squared, you have 12 squared plus 1,000, okay? So if you take 12, square it, that's, again, John emphasizing holistic completion, and you tack 1,000 onto it, that's significant as well. Can you think of where 1,000 appears in significant places in the Old Testament? Where does the number 1,000 appear in the Old Testament? Think about the promises given to Israel. 1,000. Anybody know where 1,000 is? 1,000 generations. To 1,000 generations, right. So God's judgment will be visited on, is it up to the third generation of the sinful fathers? But those that obey and bless the covenant, up to 1,000 generations. Now, does it mean that at 1,001, the Lord says, well, your 1,000's up, now you're gonna, now you're getting cut off, or not? No, it's the 1,000. It's to be a number you can't imagine. It's exalted thinking, right? It's a number saying ongoing continuance and blessings up to even 1,000 generations. That's how merciful the Lord is. That's how much He wants to bless you, and He's encouraging you to obey Him up into that. So it's a numerical number that reflects the vastness of God's grace and His mercy on His people. So you have 12 squared plus 1,000. I think John is pulling from the Old Testament here to give us this numerical number that exceeds the mind's imagination. So when you look then at the tribal order, which is different than how it appears in the Old Testament, I think there's some significant things to point out. You have Judah at the head of the tribe. Okay, Judah at the head of the list instead of Reuben. Most times in the Old Testament, Reuben is at the head of the list. You've got Judah. Now remember back in chapter 1, Jesus is the line of Judah. So you have the idea that Jesus is representing, he's the Davidic king. He is the one from Judah. So you have Judah there as the head. Joseph and Levi replace Dan and Ephraim. And then you have the promotion of tribes with a Gentile lineage. A promotion of tribes with a Gentile lineage, which would be Gad, Asher, Naphtali, which came from the lineage of Bilhah and Zilpah, which they were the concubines. And so if you follow John's logic here, he gives you a different order that reflects the New Testament realities of Jesus as the Davidic as the fulfillment of the Davidic promises which come out of the tribe of Judah. You have also the inclusion of Gentiles. So you've got, and then you have the tribes that were left in judgment that are left out there. So I think John is saying that this is the people of God that reflects New Testament realities. Now, John then, I think he sees the same community that emerges from every tribe, tongue, and nation that nobody can number. So it's the fulfillment of the Abrahamic promise that as the stars are in the sky, so many are Abraham's offspring going to be. Well, here's Abraham's offspring, perfected Israel, whole Israel, and Israel from every tribe, tongue, and nation that no one can see, or that no one can count or imagine. The other thing to notice here is that the same pattern that appears in chapter 5 when John hears and sees Jesus, we see also here. So he hears, just like we saw in chapter 5, okay, when Jesus hears the voice speaking, turns, and then he sees the vision of Christ and of all the elders. The same pattern happens here. John hears the cry of the 144,000. Then he turns to see, and what does he see? Well, he sees this innumerable number of people praising God, and they are waving the palm branches in worship of Jesus. They have the white robes, and they are the ones who have come out of the tribulation. So if you think about John's audience, they're in tribulation. John's already said that in chapter 1. They have to endure. You read chapters 2 and 3 to see what these churches are actually going through, and they're being encouraged to stay faithful because the reward is coming. And then John unveils the ongoing judgment of the world that is going to happen. Then we get to chapter 7, and John says, but here is who the redeemed are. Here's where history is going. If you stay faithful, here's what you get. You are perfected Israel. And you are part of this community that no one can number that will be praising God and that comes out of this tribulation time. So I think it's an encouragement to John's audience and to us to stay faithful because this is who we are and this is what is coming. So again, John hears, John sees, and I think this is what John is speaking to. He's speaking to these churches to encourage them to persevere because this is where history is going. Though the judgment falls on the unrepentant, unbelieving world, you will be saved out of tribulation as you stay faithful to Christ. Same message he's giving to these churches in chapters 2 and 3. So that's my reading. Again, I could be wrong, but those are my reasons for reading it that way. All right, we got to pick up the pace here. Okay, so let's see. All right, so let's go again to the 7 trumpets now. With the trumpets, I think what we have is the same pattern you see with the seals, but an intensification. So I think with the trumpets, and then you'll get to the bowls in chapter 16. And I think what's happening here is you see the same pattern of sevens happening again, with judgment being visited on the world, and then an interlude where the church is they show the situation of the church, is an intensification of judgment. An intensification of judgment. So with chapter 16, which we'll look at here in just a couple minutes, with chapter 16, I think you get the ultimate final judgment because you have Christ then returning at that point and God coming in victory. It's an intensification. So as history continues, the intensification of world disruption will intensify leading up to Christ's return. Just like tribulation for God's people will most likely continue to intensify up into the return of Christ. So the first 4 trumpets are intensification of the 4 seals, and it's reflecting the same plagues you see against Egypt. So again, I think John is drawing on God's judgment on Egypt and now God's judgment on the world. So you see a similar pattern there. Trumpet 5, you have the fall of Satan and the release of his minions to torment the earth, but believers will be protected. Trumpet 6 is the release of chaos from the east. Now the east could be an allusion to Israel's former enemies from the east, like Babylon and Assyria. It could be a mention of Rome, because Rome is also going to be a major player later in Revelation. It could be a future enemy that is going to come to cause world disruption from the east. So there's different ways that the people from the east could be looked at or interpreted. I think, again, if we look at John in his context, Israel's primary enemies always come from the east, and so he's talking about just turmoil in that region and in that symbolic way. Now we get to chapter 10, and again, we have another interlude. So we've got the intensification of judgment happening, what's going to happen with God's people. So in chapter 10 then, again, we're hitting a lot of choppy interpretive waters here. So here's my best shot. So like Ezekiel, John receives the word from the angel as a little scroll, which is both sweet, comforting the saints, and bitter because of the coming judgment on the unrepentant. So it's very similar to how Ezekiel received the scroll also. Now when it's talking about the temple here, I don't think it's talking about a literal coming third temple. There are some that argue that there's a third temple that's going to come. I'm not as convinced by that, primarily because the New Testament doesn't speak about a third temple. When the New Testament talks about the temple, it's talking about either the judgment on the current temple that Jesus predicted in Matthew 24 and other places in the Gospels, and we know happened in 70 AD. And then the rest of the New Testament, when it's talking about the temple, is talking about the people of God. So I think to read a third temple into the text is speculative. So I would be, I just would hold that with a very open hand because it's speculative. And you have to make a number of interpretive moves to get to a third temple based on your reading of other Old Testament texts. And again, we want the New Testament to be our primary guide. And if our New Testament is the primary guide, the temple is almost always spoken of in terms of God's people, unless it's talking about judgment on the current temple. So I think we got to take that seriously. I think we have to take that seriously. So I think what John is talking about here is a temple sanctuary that is being persecuted by the nations. And that's the church. The church is surrounded by hostility and is continuing to be persecuted. Now, the persecution is going to be, and this is where we get reflections on Daniel, is going to be for that 3.5 year period. So you see that that times and time and a half language that we find also in Daniel. Now, again, very controversial. So everything I'm saying here is controversial, but here we go. We're going to go where Calvin never wanted to go. I think what we see here is the second half of what Daniel talks about in his prophecy. So if you, there's a way to count Daniel's, his dating if we go back to 526 BC with the Edict of Cyrus, when Cyrus lets the people of God go out. So this is a little bit speculative, but the dating actually works here. So if you count backwards, so you've got 526 BC, the Edict of Cyrus, so 69 weeks that Daniel talks about, these are Sabbath cycles, takes you from 526 BC all the way up to, if you count those Sabbath cycles, you land somewhere around AD 27, which would have been when Jesus would have started his ministry, possibly the baptism of Jesus, okay? So if the 70th week begins in AD 27 with the career and the start of Jesus with his baptism, then the middle of that week, again, you landed 31, okay? Jesus died somewhere, Jesus' career was like AD 30 to 33. So if that's the middle week then, if that's the middle week, you have Jesus' death and resurrection, which is the symbolic cutting off of the sacrifices that Daniel's talking about, okay? Now, the sacrifices aren't literally cut off until 70 AD, okay? But from what we know from the book of Hebrews, the sacrifices become irrelevant at the resurrection of Jesus. So with Jesus, the sacrifices then are cut off. So if you're confused right now, you're like, this isn't in Revelation. You're right. It's not in Revelation. This is all in Daniel, okay? So we're reflecting on Daniel in light of what John is saying here in Revelation. So if what Daniel is referring to is the ministry of Jesus, it's possible then that the persecution of God's people and of the dragon against Mary and Mary's children, against the woman and her child that we see in Revelation 12, it's possible then that when we're talking about this other 3.5 weeks, it's the other half of the rest of Daniel's 70th week, which is a time of tribulation. Now, the 3.5 also is a number that doesn't quite reach 7. It doesn't reach 7. It's not 7, it's 3.5. The unbelieving world is experiencing the full 7 of God's wrath. The church is only going through 3.5 of tribulation. So, just like Jesus said in Matthew 24, that the times of tribulation are cut off for the sake of the elect. You see this also reflected in Daniel, how God's people are going to survive in the midst of all these hostile nations. I think what John is trying to describe to us using Daniel's numbering system is that the time of tribulation will be cut off so God's people will be preserved. So God's people will not experience 7, they'll experience 3.5. So if it's the second half of Daniel's 70th week, then this is the church age being characterized by tribulation. Now, you could also possibly, there's other ways to work with the numbering that are possible. In fact, the book I showed you from Hamilton has a different way to read Daniel's numbering that also could be persuasive, but I'm giving you this viewpoint, right? So there's other viewpoints out there about how the 3.5 works. This is what I think is, I find this more persuasive because, again, it seems to line up with the New Testament realities. So that leads us to the 2 witnesses then. Oh, man. I'm running out of time. Okay. Okay, I'll try to move through this quickly. And then we can do like a little review next week before we get to the millennial kingdom. I think that the 2 witnesses are a reflection of what we see in Zechariah. So I would see the 2 witnesses then being a anointed witness, being the church who as a kingdom of priests, again, bears witness to the unbelieving world, and then they are killed for their witness. However, they don't stay dead. They are resurrected and end up becoming conquerors. And so part of John's message is the reality of martyrdom, that your witness may cost you your life, but to be faithful to the end. Okay, it's the same message John is also giving to these churches in chapters 2 and 3 as he's talking about this time of tribulation. So the 2 witnesses, I think, represent the church, and that's based off the way in which they reflect Zechariah 4. So I've got a bunch of notes on this. I'm not going to have time to get into, but there you go. You can look at the notes on your own. This leads us to the last trumpet then. So you have the pause between the 6 trumpets, and then you've got a pause in the interlude in which you look at the protection of God's people. And the last trumpet then is really the center of Revelation. This is the center point of Revelation, where the kingdoms belong now to Christ. The kingdoms of this world become the kingdoms of Christ. This is really the central message then that we have. Then we have the career of Mary and the beasts. So Mary gives birth to Christ, hides him for 3 years from the dragons, attempts to kill him. He vows to make wars on the saints. Then we have the first beast and the second beast. Now I think the first beast is representative of ungodly authorities and institutions. And the second beast then, of course, comes up and is calling for worship, for allegiance and worship of God's people. The this leads us to 666. Most scholars believe that 666 is a configuration of Nero, who was a famous emperor who was ruthlessly persecuted God's people in the mid-60s. So I'm out of time. Okay. When we come back next week, we'll start back at Nero, and then we'll do the final bowls of the bowls of wrath, and then we'll get to the millennial kingdom. I'll conclude with this. I think what you see here with Satan, the beast, the false prophet, is you've got, again, the ungodly trinity, and we're going to see how Satan uses ungodly authority to try to get people to worship and give their allegiance to something other than Christ. And that's going to be a pattern throughout history. Throughout history, ungodly authority tries to draw God's people away from Christ and submit to them, whether it's ungodly governing authority or ungodly false religion. And that's going to be a pattern that happens all throughout history, and John is going to talk about that culminating in the end, which we'll talk about that more next week. But I think that's what these the beasts are representative of, and that's why Nero is so important as 666, because he embodies that Antichrist, the one who is calling people to worship him, not Jesus. So we'll talk more about the significance of that. Now, I think by the time John wrote Revelation, Nero was off the scene. Nero was dead. He died in 68, so if we have a dating of Revelation in the 90s, Nero's dead, but Nero's spirit, that spirit of Antichrist, still lives on in the current emperor, Domitian, as well as other ungodly emperors that were still to come. So we'll cover that next week. I know I gave you a lot of information today. I've got the extended notes for you if you want to look at that. If you have more questions, be happy to talk more. But let's pray, and we will get ready for worship at 10:15. So let's pray. Father, we thank you that even in the midst of our uncertainties about how to interpret these texts, Lord, we rejoice to know that you will come again. We rejoice to know that even as we go through tribulation, you will preserve us to the end. So God, that is our hope for the church around the world, for the church here in the U.S., that you would preserve us to the end, Lord, and that you would help us to be faithful and bear witness to you and your glory and your future coming. We ask this all in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. Thanks, everybody. God bless.